A chill settles over the farmlands of central Wisconsin. It's a kind of place where life moves slowly, where neighbors nod politely on the street, and where secrets are thought to be small, ordinary things. But behind the doors of one weather-worn farmhouse, a darkness was festering. A man who seemed quiet, even harmless, carried with him obsessions too grotesque for the imagination. And when the truth finally surfaced, it shocked not only a town, but the entire nation. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. Thought I'd switch it up a little bit. But yes, today we are talking about the infamous Ed Gein. He has inspired many different shows, movies, even music. But who really was Ed Gein? And how did he come to be one of the most infamous killers of all time? So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 to the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this infamous killer together. At the start of the 20th century, Wisconsin had a strong rural character. Small farming communities dotted the landscape, and life on these farms was hard but simple. Families worked their land, raised livestock, and lived off what they produced. A simple life. The good old days, if you will. And this fostered a strong sense of self-reliance, but also isolation, as they could be quite remote. And this physical isolation meant that a family's home was its own little world, largely hidden from the outside scrutiny. And the social fabric of rural Wisconsin was tight-knit, yet pretty conservative. And many communities were anchored by churches, modest schools, and maybe a general store in the nearest village. So traditional values prevailed in this part of America. And people were expected to be industrious, devout, and reserved in personal matters. And mental health, as we think of it today, was not openly discussed, basically at all, because at the time, there was a strong stigma around psychological troubles, and those suffering from severe mental illness might be sent to distant asylums, but more often families just coped in private silence. In fact, the early 1900s were a low point in public attitudes toward mental illness. And in Wisconsin and elsewhere, society's approach was often to hide away or ignore those deemed, quote, unstable, unquote. Emotional issues or strange behavior within a family were usually kept behind closed doors. And family life in these farming communities was frequently authoritarian, and fathers were traditionally the heads of the household, but mothers too could wield fierce influence over the children's upbringing. And strict discipline was seen as a virtue. And parents would teach obedience and morality as they understood it, and sometimes with an iron hand, if you know what I mean. Whoopsh. And religious fundamentalism was common, especially among immigrant communities. And sermons about sin and virtue filled Sunday mornings, and many households carry those fiery teachings into everyday life. So in this environment, a domineering parent who imposed rigid moral codes on their family wouldn't have been seen as particularly unusual. And outsiders generally didn't interfere in family matters, even if things were dysfunctional behind the scenes. So within this rural background lies the tiny village of Plainfield, Wisconsin. And in the early 1900s, Plainfield was a speck on the map of central Wisconsin, surrounded by wetlands and farms. And the population in 1900 was only around 728 people, peaking at the time and then declining in subsequent decades, down to about 580 people by 1920. But it was the kind of place where everyone truly knew everyone, and daily life revolved around basic commerce and farming. And a handful of family-run businesses lined Main Street, serving the needs of local farm families. And an old opera house built in 1902 doubled as a dance hall, church, bar, and even a movie theater over the years, illustrating how one building often wore many hats in a small community. And Wisconsin was becoming America's dairyland around this time, and there was a practical, no-frills ethos among the townsfolk. And people worked hard during the day and looked out for their neighbors when they could. Yet despite the friendliness on the surface, Plainfield's remoteness fostered a mind-your-own-business mentality. And if a family chose to keep to themselves on a farm outside of town, few would pry. So it was easy for someone to live a fairly reclusive life without drawing much attention, a very important factor for the story to come. And overall, early 20th century Plainfield offered a picture of secluded small-town America, quiet, insular, and set in its own ways. And the stage was set for a future tragedy. A tragedy that would seem utterly inconceivable against such an unassuming rural backdrop. And little did those farmers and shopkeepers know that one of their own would become the stuff of American nightmares. So the Geen saga begins with two people who, on the surface, appeared unremarkable for their time, and that is George Philip Geen and Augusta Wilhelmine Lurk. So George and Augusta were both children of German immigrants and were raised in Wisconsin in the late 19th century. And George, born in 1873, grew into a hefty, hardworking man, but one beset by personal demons, because he had a reputation for being an alcoholic, and he drifted through various jobs, never able to hold anything steady for long. And over the years, George worked as a carpenter and even a tannery hand, but his lack of discipline and heavy drinking kept sabotaging any chance of success. And he, by all means, appeared to be a man who would rather drown his disappointments in whiskey than confront them. And in contrast, Augusta, born in 1878, was George's polar opposite in personality, because Augusta came from a strict old Lutheran family of Prussian Germans. And the old Lutherans were known for their ultra-conservative, fire and brimstone brand of faith. It's God's word or nothing, basically. So from a young age, Augusta was taught that the world is a wicked place. And not wicked is wicked awesome. Wicked is in evil, infected with sin in every thought and deed. And this creed became the core of her being. And she developed a formidable, no-nonsense character and deeply religious, proudly self-righteous, and utterly convinced of her moral superiority. So Augusta was not necessarily warm or affectionate, if you catch my drift. Instead, she was described as domineering and obsessively pious. And she believed it was her God-given duty to steer others, especially her family, away from evil, which will become extremely ironic as we make our way through this case. But George and Augusta would marry on December 11th, 1900. And George would be 27 and Augusta would be 22. And she likely hoped marriage would offer her stability and children to raise in righteousness. And George, for his part, probably saw Augusta as a strong woman who could keep him anchored. And in their early years together, Augusta took charge of the household finances and opened a small grocery store in La Crosse. And by all accounts, she was the breadwinner, a rather unusual arrangement for 1900. And her shop did well enough to support the family when George couldn't, because remember, he's just off drinking and just being shitty at his jobs. And meanwhile, George's pride suffered under the shadow of his wife's competence and open contempt. And Augusta would openly berate George. Yet, because of her strict Lutheran beliefs about marriage, divorce was unthinkable, could not happen. And so resentment festered in their home. Very healthy. And in January 1902, the Geens welcomed their first child, a son named Henry George Geen. And Augusta had desperately wanted a daughter, someone she could mold into her own devout image, an obedient girl safe from the corruption of men. So the birth of a boy was a disappointment to her. Not a great start for this little guy. But still, Augusta was determined to raise Henry right. So she quickly established herself as the ultimate authority over the child, essentially sidelining George's role as a father. And those early family years were dominated by Augusta's growing control. And she preached and scolded, making it clear that sin lurked around every single corner, just molding an extremely paranoid child. And George, increasingly emasculated, drank even more and grew but when inebriated. So domestic life became a kind of tug-of-war, because there was Augusta's stern discipline on one side and George's drunken outbursts on the other hand. So as the years went by, Augusta's influence only expanded. And on August 27th, 1906, she gave birth to a second son in La Crosse. And that was Edward Theodore Geen, known as Ed, the guy we're talking about today. And this child, too, was not a girl. Oh, 2 strikes, and she's pissed. So, if she couldn't have a daughter, Augusta resolved that her sons would be kept pure at all costs. From the moment Ed was born, Augusta's word was law in the Geen household. Again, not a good start to this little guy's life. So she would tolerate no dissent from George or the boys. Augusta was queen bitch of this house. So a stern, joyless routine was established in this household, and that is that the children would attend to their chores, and Augusta would attend to their souls, basically. Their souls that were just caked with evil, in Augusta's opinion. So every afternoon, she set aside time to read the Bible to her sons, often selecting fire and brimstone verses from the Old Testament or Revelation about divine punishment and the evils of depravity. Old Testament, if anybody's read it, man, that shit is crazy. All right. I got it read to me as a kid. It's the stuff of nightmares. Highly recommend New Testament, little lighter. But she drilled into Henry and little Ed that the world outside was filthy and a very immoral place. And in Augusta's eyes, nearly all women, herself excepted, were harlots and instruments of the devil, out to seduce and destroy men. So, just a classic boy mom, basically. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding, okay? My sister's a boy mom. She's a great boy mom. I'm kidding. But we all know who I'm talking about, all right? Those moms that just, never want their boys to have a girlfriend or a wife or whatever. It's a little weird. Anyway, so drinking alcohol was a damnable sin. Intercourse was evil, and only total obedience to God and to Augusta as God's emissary could save her family from hellfire. So within this fervent atmosphere, George Gein receded into irrelevance. And Augusta's scorn for her husband was never concealed either. And like we said, she openly berated him as a useless drunk who was headed for hell. Just very healthy household. And just powerless to change his situation, George mostly slunk into the background, nursing his bottle of whiskey. And when he did get involved with the boys, it was usually in anger. And he would furiously slap Ed's head, sometimes hitting him until the boy's ears rang, which is horrible. And these beatings only reinforced Ed's fear of adoration of his mother, because she was the one who claimed to love and protect him from a sinful world, whereas his father met his tears with violence. So we're getting a very unhealthy attachment. The umbilical cord is growing stronger between Eddie and Mommy. And though she was also verbally abusive to the boys, believing them to become eventual failures, just like their father was in her eyes. But by the time Ed was a toddler and Henry a young boy, Augusta had effectively constructed an emotional fortress around her family. She was basically a cult leader, and she would even forbade the children from having any friends over, or just friends in general. These kids were extremely secluded. And she just poured her energy into running the household and lecturing her sons on morality. And in public, Augusta was outwardly respectable, a hardworking store owner and farm wife. And neighbors in La Crosse might have found her rigid and holier than thou, but nothing about the Geins' early years drew serious outside concern. Remember, everybody just kind of kept to themselves and were like, oof, that's their problem. She's a bit crazy, but, she's hardworking and everything. So nobody really, turned their heads. Behind closed doors, however, Augusta's fanaticism and George's failure created a very toxic home environment. And when the stresses of city life and George's drinking grew too much, Augusta sought a drastic change. You know what I love about fall? Those cozy nights when you actually want to turn on the oven and make something hearty and warm. And that's exactly why I've been obsessed with HelloFresh lately. And they just dropped their biggest menu refresh yet. And honestly, it's been a game changer for my dinner routine. I personally use HelloFresh, and you should too. But honestly, they've literally doubled their menu. We're talking 100 different options every single week. Last night, for example, I made their Korean-style beef tacos with this incredible gochujang creme. I probably said that wrong. And Caleb couldn't believe that I actually cooked it. And the best part is that everything shows up pre-portioned. So I'm not buying a whole bottle of gochujang that'll sit in my fridge forever. And what really got me hooked is how they've stepped up the health game, because they've got these high protein options now, which is really important to Caleb and I, and recipes with 2 or more servings of veggies built right in. Plus, and this blew my mind, you can get steak and seafood recipes every week with no extra charge. So 3 times more seafood on the menu now, all at the same price. And look, 91% of customers say they feel healthier eating with HelloFresh, and 9 out of 10 say dinner is straight up more delicious. And I'm one of them. It's America's #1 choice for home cooking, and once you try it, you'll get why. But seriously, the best way to cook just got better, so go to hellofresh.com/CCCM10FM now to get 10 free meals plus a free item for life. And that's 1 per box with active subscriptions. That's hellofresh.com/CCCM10FM to get 10 free meals plus a free item for life. Trust me on this one though, your dinner game is about to level up. Thank you so much for HelloFresh for supporting this channel and sponsoring this video. Let's get back to it. So it was around 1915 she relocated the family to a farm on the outskirts of the tiny town of Plainfield. And she deliberately chose this 155-acre farm for its seclusion, far from any immorality of larger towns. So by removing her family to an isolated patch of rural land, Augusta believed she could shield her sons from the corrupt influences once and for all. And indeed, the Gein farm would become a world unto itself, with Augusta, its unquestioned cult ruler, at the head. And George was too beaten down and often just too drunk to protest the move. Plus, he didn't make any money. Like, Augusta just had all the power in this relationship. Thus, as the Gein family headed into Ed's childhood years, Augusta's grip was ironclad, and the stage was set for a very peculiar upbringing. So Edward, or Ed Gein, spent his earliest years under the absolute authority of his mother, as we know. And the Plainfield farmhouse was old and modest, but Augusta saw it as a sanctuary from the modern world's sins. And for Ed, it became a lonely kingdom of fields and dense silence. And he was rarely allowed to leave the property except for school. And inside the home, Augusta's presence loomed as large as ever. And every day, Ed heard the same fiery sermons from his mother. The wickedness of the world, the evils of lust, the certainty of God's wrath. And she punctuated her lectures by quoting scripture on murder, death, and divine retribution. You know, just classic nighttime bed stories. But ironically, foreshadowing the darkness that would later unfold, because Ed's impressionable mind absorbed it all. And he grew up literally idolizing Augusta, because to him, she was practically infallible, his guiding light in a world full of temptations. But Augusta's love was harsh and conditional, you know, as a mother's love is, and she enforced discipline with a heavy hand. And in one especially traumatizing incident, young Ed was caught by his mother doing something a boy does when they hit puberty, if you know what I mean, in the bathtub. And Augusta flew into a rage, and she grabbed him by his you-know-what and called them the curse of man, scolding him that act was a filthy abomination. And Ed was mortified and learned to associate any normal urge with intense guilt and fear of his mother's wrath. Again, just very healthy practices going on here, and by that I mean extremely toxic. So the boy's childhood was marked by social isolation and strange influences. And as a child, at around the age of 7, Ed reportedly witnessed his parents slaughter a hog in the farm's shed. And disturbingly, Ed later recounted that watching this violent butchery excited him so much that he experienced an involuntary release, if you know what I mean, which is just not cool to think about, but it happened. And this shocking reaction suggests that even at a young age, Ed's psyche was mixing violence and arousal in a very abnormal way. And whether Augusta ever learned of this incident is unknown, but it shows the seeds of Ed's pathology were quietly taking root in childhood. And despite his bizarre home life, Ed outwardly appeared as a shy, awkward boy, not a little boy who really liked watching animals die a little too much. And as if the kid didn't have it hard enough growing up, a congenital growth on his eyelid gave him a bit of a lazy eye, and a lesion on his tongue caused him to speak with a slight lisp. And in 1915, Ed began attending the local one-room Roche Cree grade school, which had just 12 students total. And this tiny schoolhouse was essentially his only window to the outside world. And Ed did fairly well in class. In fact, he was described as a voracious reader, but socially he was a misfit. And his classmates would find him odd, because he would sometimes laugh to himself out loud, just kind of out of the blue, as if hearing an inside joke that no one else understood, which, I mean, who doesn't do that? You know, I do that sometimes. And this was likely just a coping mechanism, but it earned him some ridicule. And other children would mock him for his weird giggling and effeminate mannerisms, which only isolated him further. And being ostracized hurt Ed deeply, but at home he got zero sympathy, as we know. You know, mommy doesn't give a shit. So if Ed ever came home crying because the kids at school bullied him, Augusta and George responded with scorn or even violence. So this kid could not catch a break. I have sympathy for little Ed. And Augusta would chastise Ed for wanting friends among sinners, and George would be violent as he usually was. And as a result, Ed had no friends, and Ed learned to swallow his hurt and withdraw further into himself. And his only close companion was his older brother, Henry, who was 5 years his senior. But even that bond was complicated, because Henry sometimes acted as another authority figure. Because as you can imagine, Henry's going through all the same stuff, and usually kids project what is projected onto them, so his only outlet to let out any anger is on Ed, so Ed's just getting it from every side. So lacking any normal social outlets, Ed immersed himself into books and his own imagination. And he particularly loved adventure stories and eventually pulp magazines, which were cheap fiction magazines printed on wood pulp paper. And he would happily spend time with books over interacting with others. And even in these early years, Augusta's grip on Ed's mind was so tight that he barely dared to think for himself, because he was conditioned to believe that the outside world was evil and only his mother was good. And Ed later said he never once dated or had any interest in girls growing up, because Augusta had effectively made the idea of romance or any sort of sexuality as terrifying and repulsive to him. And instead, Ed focused on being the dutiful son, helping with farm chores and trying, often futilely, to earn a kind word from his mother. And Ed's formal education ended almost as soon as it began, because after completing the 8th grade, Ed would drop out of school. And this was not uncommon for 1920s farm country boys, because many boys left school to work on the farm full-time or because their family saw no need for higher education. And in Ed's case, he had only ever attended a tiny rural school, and high school was likely out of the reach logistically. So by his mid-teens, Ed was essentially confined to the family farm 24/7, with only occasional trips into Plainfield for supplies. So he continued to read nonstop on his own, maintaining a decent literacy, but any chance at normal social development was completely cut off. So Ed was truly just devoted to his mommy to an excessive degree, even for that era. And sometime in their early lives, Augusta made her sons swear an oath to remain virgins until death. That's a big ask, Mom. Okay, that's a lot. And she warned Henry and Ed that any intercourse was a ticket to eternal damnation, and losing their chastity would make them no better than their despised father in her eyes. Why does she get a pass? But incredibly, both boys, likely under coercion by their formidable mother, pledged to obey. And Ed took this vow very, very seriously, further contributing to how he never pursued any romantic relationship in his life. And such was Augusta's power over her son's psyche. So by the end of Ed's school years, the family dynamics had settled into a grim routine. Augusta's word was truly law. Henry and Ed labored on the farm under her direction, and George spent most of the time drunk and bitter on the sidelines. So Ed's worldview, having had almost no healthy outside input, was essentially an extension of Augusta's. He did not think for himself, and he genuinely believed that she taught him that outside their farm lay a world full of sin, that all women, aside from Augusta, of course, were degraded creatures, and that he must remain pure and obedient at all costs. Yet behind Ed's compliance, dark urges and confusion were bubbling, because he was a teenager experiencing natural curiosities. But every impulse was met with shame and repression. So this inner turmoil went unnoticed and unaddressed. And to the townsfolk of Plainfield, Ed was mostly invisible during these years. No one could have imagined that this boy, so seemingly timid and insignificant, would later unleash horrors that defied imagination. All right, we need to take a quick minute to tell you about my new obsession, and that is Lola blankets, the thing I'm wrapped up in right now. And I'm not even exaggerating when I say this has completely changed my life, at least the comfort in my life. And you know me, I am a blanket person. I've got that whole cozy corner set up with my stack of books and my current Netflix binge. But this Lola blanket, it's on a whole other level. I truly wish you could feel how soft this is through the screen. It's this incredible vegan faux fur that's somehow both luxurious and practical. I'm currently sporting the caramel and cream color, but I have 2 other ones as well in their largest size. And they're not only comfortable, but they also look really nice too, and they've totally elevated my living room. And one of my friends even came over last week. Yes, I have friends. And they immediately asked where I got this blanket. Even Jay asked me if it's actually worth getting, and I told him straight up, you need to get one immediately. And even when you wash it, it stays really nice and soft. I've washed this one probably 10 or 15 times already, and there's no pilling and no weird shedding. My old throws could never. Plus, it has this 4-way stretch that just I don't know, gives you a hug back, which is really nice. And Lola has over 10,000 5-star reviews, and honestly, I get why, and I'm one of them. And they call it the world's #1 blanket, and that's not just marketing talk. And I've already got the matching pillows as well. And during the holiday season, you bet your butt I'll be giving everyone in my family a Lola blanket. And for a limited time, you're getting 35% off your entire order at lolablankets.com using code CCCM at checkout. That's lolablankets.com with code CCCM for 35% off. And when they ask where you heard about them, please tell them I sent you. It really helps support the show. But seriously, wrap yourself in luxury with Lola Blankets because you deserve it. Thank you so much to Lola Blankets for supporting the channel and sponsoring this video, and let's get back to it. So as Ed Gein grew into his late teens and 20s, the 1920s and 1930s, his world remained in the cramped confines of the family farm and the grip of his mother, of course. And his father, George Gein, deteriorated significantly during this period because years of alcohol caught up to him. So he became weak and frequently ill and unable to contribute much to the farm. And by the late 1930s, George was essentially a helpless invalid, entirely dependent on the family members whom he had alienated with his drinking and abuse. And Augusta and the boys feared and despised George, considering him a living embodiment of failure. And he spent his days mostly in a stupor, offering occasional slurred complaints, but little else. And in April 1940, George Gein finally died. Officially of heart failure, likely made worse by his alcoholism at the age of 66. And Augusta, ever unforgiving, reportedly remarked that her husband's death was a result of his own weakness and that he was now reaping divine punishment. I'm sure they had just a wonderful marriage together. Guy was probably just hoping for death. Not that he was a good guy, he was also evil, but you know. Just a whole shit situation. And naturally, Augusta expressed zero grief during this time, because now, with George gone, the Gein household consisted of just Augusta and her 2 adult sons. Henry, now nearing 40 years old, and Ed, who was in his mid-30s. And the dynamic began to shift in subtle ways. And the brothers, particularly Henry, assumed the responsibilities of keeping the farm and finances afloat. So both men would take on odd jobs around Plainfield to supplement their meager farm income. And they did handyman work for neighbors, repairing roofs, doing carpentry, manual labor. And Ed in particular found his own niche, which was babysitting children. I don't know about that. But Ed would relate easier to children than to adults. And perhaps because his own emotional development was stunted and he felt less judged by kids. And neighbors considered Ed and Henry trustworthy and honest workers. And out in the community, the Gein brothers gave little cause for any sort of alarm. They were dependable if you needed help, and Ed's quiet demeanor led many to view him as harmless. He was just the shy bachelor who could fix your fence or watch your children, known to be polite and somewhat childlike himself. Behind closed doors, however, significant tensions were brewing between the Gein brothers and their formidable mother, because Henry had never been as wholly under Augusta's spell as Ed was. And as he entered middle age, Henry began to challenge Augusta's authority in ways Ed would never dare. And Henry started dating a local woman, a divorced single mother of 2, and expressed plans of moving in with her. I'm scared. Because this was an open act of defiance against Augusta's wishes. She would have seen a divorced woman as a living sin, as if she didn't already see women in general as just deplorable creatures. And what's more is Henry had the audacity to criticize Augusta in front of Ed. And he told Ed that their mother was overbearing and that Ed's attachment to her was unhealthy. Henry's just saying what we're all thinking, isn't he? And these comments shocked and hurt Ed deeply, and he reacted as if Henry was uttering blasphemy. Because to Ed, as we know, Augusta could do no wrong, and hearing his brother speak ill of their sainted mother was nearly unthinkable. So the relationship between the brothers started to fray, and Henry's independent streak just started to grow, while Ed remained ever the dutiful son. And by the early 1940s, Henry's private attitude toward his mother was reportedly one of growing resentment. And he saw Augusta as a toxic influence, and he worried aloud about what would become of Ed when something would happen to their mother. And Henry allegedly confided to friends that he was concerned for Ed's mental state, given how obsessed Ed was with Augusta. And this concern turned out to be a tragic foresight, because on May 16th, 1944, a mysterious incident occurred that would later raise many eyebrows, because the brothers would be burning brush on their property, a routine task of clearing marsh vegetation. But the fire would blaze out of control and drew the attention of the Plainfield Volunteer Fire Department. After firefighters doused the flames, Henry was nowhere to be found. And Ed claimed that he had lost sight of Henry in the confusion. A search party went out that night and found Henry's dead body lying face down. And Henry was 43 years old at the time. And at first glance, it appeared he might have succumbed to heart failure while fighting the fire, as there was no significant burns on his body. And the local coroner listed asphyxiation from smoke as the cause of death, and authorities accepted it as just a tragic death. However, some details didn't add up. Because according to one biographer, Henry's corpse had bruises on the head that suggested he may have been struck. No autopsy was performed, and given Ed's reputation as a simple, good-natured soul, police didn't investigate further. And it wasn't until years later, after Ed's crimes came to light, that people looked back and wondered, did Ed Gein kill his own brother? Was this mysterious fire the cover for a revenge born out of Ed's devotion to Augusta and fury at Henry's descent? And one criminologist later called it the Cain and Abel aspect of the case. Got to go back to the Old Testament to read that one, folks. But for those of you who don't know, it implied that Ed removed Henry to have their mother all to himself. Ugh. And while we'll never know for sure, the circumstances remain suspicious to say the least. At the very least, Henry's death conveniently silenced the only person who openly challenged Augusta's dominance. So with Henry now gone, Ed Gein was now alone with Augusta. And he was in his late 30s, yet in many ways still a child under his mother's thumb. And the traumatic events of 1944 only intensified Ed's dependence. And shortly after Henry's death, Augusta suffered a paralyzing stroke. And the domineering matriarch was suddenly left very weak and partially incapacitated. And Ed responded with unwavering dedication. And he waited on his ailing mother hand and foot. And all the resentment he might have harbored over her harsh treatment was buried under an almost pathetic devotion. And he rarely left her side. And to the outside eyes, he appeared to be the ideal, dutiful son, sacrificing his own life to care for his invalid mother. And for a brief period, it seemed Augusta appreciated Ed's loyalty. But Augusta was not one to soften easily, as we know. And an incident late in 1945 illustrated that her fiery judgment remained intact. And Ed recounted that he had driven Augusta, still frail from her stroke, to visit a neighbor, a man named Smith, to buy some straw. And while they were there, Smith brutally dogged to death in front of Augusta and Ed. So Augusta witnessed this horrifying act, but what upset her far more was something else. And that was a woman came out of Smith's house during the commotion. And Augusta realized this woman was Smith's girlfriend, so they were living together, unmarried. And this meant this was Smith's harlot, as Augusta would spit out. And she was livid, not about the horrific animal cruelty, but about the immorality of an unwed woman being present in a man's home. And she had a second stroke soon afterwards. So her health went into rapid decline after that, as if her body could no longer sustain the fury and righteousness burning inside her. And on December 29th, 1945, Augusta Wilhelmine Gein died at the age of 67. And for Ed, the loss was cataclysmic. He was absolutely devastated. And in the words of biographer Harold Schechter, Ed had, quote, lost his only friend and one true love, and he was absolutely alone in the world, unquote. And this dramatic phrasing isn't an exaggeration, as we know, because Augusta had indeed been everything to Ed. She was his mother, his mentor, his commander, and the object of his twisted adoration. And Ed's entire universe revolved around pleasing her. And now, suddenly, she was gone. And in a very real sense, the now almost 40-year-old Ed was now an orphan, because he was severely stunted emotionally. And worse, an orphan who had never been allowed a life outside of his mother's shadow. So the aftermath of Augusta's death would mark the end of Ed's remaining tether to normalcy, because he had no siblings left, no friends, no spouse or lover, no father, and no mother. He had nothing. And the last human being he truly loved in his own warped way was buried in Plainfield Cemetery, leaving Ed Gein utterly alone on that isolated farm. And this moment at the end of 1945 was the turning point, and the descent into utter madness was about to begin. And all the evil seeds that had been planted in Ed's psyche over decades, the repression, the violent fantasies, the unhealthy obsession with his mother, now had free rein to grow in horrific ways. So after Augusta Gein's death, Ed Gein's life slipped into eerie solitude and derangement. And he remained on the family's 155-acre Plainfield farm, but it was now a tomb of memories rather than any sort of home. And in an act of preservation, Ed boarded up every area of the farmhouse that his mother had used, including the entire upstairs, the parlor, and the living room, sealing them off like a really weird shrine. And he left these rooms completely untouched, frozen in time with her furnishings gathering dust. And they stayed spotlessly preserved behind those closed doors, while the rest of the house just fell into squalor. And Ed himself moved into a small bedroom adjacent to the kitchen and basically lived in chaos amidst filth and junk, never cleaning or caring for the house beyond his mother's sacred spaces. And to support himself, Ed did occasional odd jobs just as before. And beginning in 1951, he even received a small government farm subsidy as part of a soil conservation program, and that money helped him get by without having to farm much. But he continued working as a handyman for neighbors and on road crews when needed. And he also sold an 80-acre parcel of land that Henry had owned somewhere between 1946 and 1956. So outwardly, Ed's routine might have seemed somewhat normal for a reclusive bachelor, but internally, something had broken. And with no Augusta to supervise or restrain him, Ed's mind wandered down dark and unthinkable paths. And this is when he became an avid consumer of pulp magazines and cheap adventure books, even more so than he was as a teen. And it wasn't the same content, because this wasn't the innocent kind, because Ed primarily fixated on stories that fed his gruesome curiosities. And he particularly loved tales of cannibalism, headhunters, and the German bad guy atrocities. I don't know if I can say that word without YouTube getting freaked out, but you know who I'm talking about, okay? And one of his known interests was the case of Ilse Koch, the wife of a German bad guy concentration camp commandant who was infamously accused of making lampshades from prisoners' tattooed skin. Ugh. So scary and nasty. And Ed read every detail of such accounts with fascination. And it's haunting to note that some of Koch's alleged practices, using human skin for household items, mirror what Ed himself would do later. And he also pored over anatomy texts. And at some point in the late 1940s, Ed Gein crossed a boundary that few could even fathom, and he would begin robbing graves. So as Ed's grotesque activities escalated, so did the evident pathology behind them. And Gein later revealed an astonishing motive to investigators. He was literally trying to create a, quote, woman suit, unquote, from human skin so that he could become his mother to literally crawl into her skin, unquote. It's as chilling as it sounds, because Ed missed Augusta so terribly and was so psychologically warped that he believed he could bring some aspect of her by wearing the remains of women who reminded him of her. Just the ultimate messed up final boss mommy's boy. It was like a perverse form of idol worship and identity theft combined. So he would stitch together skin from female corpses that were already deceased because he was grave robbing. He did not kill these people yet, but he would stitch them together to fashion a copy of a female body, including a vest, like torso, or a corset of skin from shoulders to waist, and leggings made of human leg skin, and masks peeled from their faces. And when he donned these horrific costumes in the privacy of his home, Ed could pretend Augusta was still with him. My skin is, I want to crawl inside myself right now. It's horrific to think about. And this behavior goes beyond any ordinary mental illness. It was uniquely deranged. And during this descent, Ed also kept trophies and tokens. And many of these gruesome items would later be found in Ed's home, shocking the entire world. But in the late 1940s and early 1950s, no one knew this lonely old Gein place was essentially a twisted morgue. And there were a few red flags noticed by locals, but they were either dismissed or seen as eccentricities, I guess. One 16-year-old kid who knew Ed, which was the son of one of the family friends, recalled that Ed showed him some shrunken heads he kept at the farm, claiming they were war relics sent by a cousin.